Welcome to Script to Screen's Talks podcast. Script to Screen is a charitable organisation dedicated to developing the craft and culture of storytelling for the screen in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This talk series brings the creative community together to hear inspirational speakers talk about their creative process, craft, philosophy, or the creative landscape. Script to Screen is delighted to be presenting this special in conversation with Lee Tamahori, one of New Zealand's most successful and celebrated filmmakers. Throughout his formidable career, Lee has continued to bring New Zealand stories to the international stage. Lee Tamahori has an extraordinary body of work, not limited to Once Were Warriors, Mulholland Falls, Along Came a Spider, Die Another Day, and more recently, Mahana, aka the Patriach. This talk was held in October 2023 at the Capitol Cinema in Auckland. Paula Morris moderated the discussion about The Convert following its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival. Lee Tamahori is the director and co-writer of The Convert, a New Zealand and Australian co-production starring Pearce and Tioreore, Ngatai-Melbourne. This talk contains explicit language and mentions the domestic violence and sexual assault depicted in Once Were Warriors. These themes and topics could be upsetting for some listeners. Discretion is advised.
Kia ora everyone, I'm Paula Morris. I'm delighted to be talking to Lee Tamahori tonight. I have seen The Convert, though it was on one of those weird screeners where my name was up on the screen the whole time. So now I feel directly responsible for every aspect of the film myself. Now, our conversation tonight is not quite the story of my life so far, which is a quote from the new film, The Convert, but we'll cover a lot of ground, I hope. There will be some time at the end of our conversation for questions from the audience. And Jackie's told me there are 2 mics. And because this is being recorded, if you do have a question, if you put your hand up, someone will get a mic to you so that we can make sure that's recorded as well. Hopefully, as this is a script-to-screen event, we'll certainly talk about Lee's writing, relationships with writers. We've been talking a lot about the whole process and imaginative thought that goes into making something real into a movie. And we'll talk specifically, I think, about your New Zealand movies, your Maori films, as Lee called them, his films about dysfunctional families. Just briefly about The Convert, it's set in the 1830s as muskets start to proliferate and inter-iwi wars escalate. A lay preacher and former soldier played by Pearce arrives at a coastal Pākehā settlement, a community that I think is on edge in more ways than one. And he's drawn into a Māori culture that is both alien and, it turns out, quite familiar. The film premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival last month, and Lee says it was received extremely well. So, Lee, we talked about your 3 Māori films, each of them stepping further back in time and exploring in different ways masculinity, violence, the impact of colonisation. But let's start with the furthest back, The Convert. It's set in the 1830s when this was still a predominantly Maori country. Yeah. And what drew you to that particular time?
Well, I was fascinated with the idea that the Europeans were outnumbered 3,000 to 1, which is something we don't know much about that period. And it's very, very murky history. The histories are mostly oral histories from the Māori perspective, and a few sketches, no photography, and the introduction of muskets, which started in the early 1800s with sealers and whalers, ballooned into a booming trade. Oh, the other thing that fascinated me was that there was 20 years of lawlessness before the treaty was signed. From 1820 to 1840, there was absolutely no judicial. So people could kill with impunity, rob, steal, prostitute, do whatever. And eventually, it's arguable that had Christianity not penetrated the Māori culture so much, there might have been genocidal warfare going on with the introduction of muskets. But a lot of that's kind of speculative. But no, I found that it was initially I wasn't drawn to it because I thought about making a film in this period a long time ago. But because of its murkiness and its unknown nature, I felt that I could do more justice to a story that we had more concrete history and photography, like Te Kooti, Te Tokuwaru, etc., something like that. But Robin kind of talked me into it. You know, she gave me the script and said, "Are you interested in doing this?" And I said, "Well, not really." I said, "Well, because it was about a religious figure. The main character, the one that Guy Pearce ultimately plays, was a lay preacher from the Church Missionary Society, like Henry Williams or Thomas Kendall. And I'm not a great fan of religious figures because I find they proselytise too much and they believe in nonsense, basically. So, but then I thought if I could craft the figure, the main Pākehā figure, into a humanist who's hiding in priest's robes, so to speak. He said, so I created with my writer, my initial writer, Shane Danielson, a character who's on the run from himself. He's carrying enormous baggage with him, and he's hiding out in the Church Missionary Society, really. And that led us on a path to where the convert ends up. And I'm very happy with the result of it. I'm sorry you all haven't seen it, but you will. It'll make the rounds here. It's going to be a theatrical release in February. But it's quite an enormous task because we had to... It'll be controversial as usual, like Once Were Warriors was controversial and Mahana wasn't because it was a softer type of story. But this one will have the usual controversies that surround the Māori Pākehā environment that we live in.
Well, so let's talk about some of that. Okay, so you credit Michael Bennett as coming up with the story, so explain that to us.
Michael Bennett wrote the original screenplay from a book called Wolf. And
by Hamish Clayton about Te Raupraha, yeah? Yeah.
And so the initial character is about a Raupraha character, which I retained. I renamed him. But it's in the middle of the Musket Wars. But I wanted... My producers, Robin and her associates from Australia, were worried that the screenplay that existed didn't have enough oomph to make it, because it was going to cost a lot of money. That period is very expensive to recreate. So they wanted to know if I wanted to make that script, and I said, no, I didn't want to make that script. No bad feelings towards Michael or his screenplay. It's just I didn't want to do that character. I didn't want to unpick what John Colley, who was working with, who I'd worked with on Mahana, he and Michael had written a screenplay together. So I said, look, I'll tell you what I think I would do with this film if I was it, but don't tell John and Michael because it's only what I would do, not what any other director would do something else. Another director would make this screenplay, but not me. I didn't want to. And they said, what was wrong with it? And I said, well, from my perspective, what it's missing was a first act. The story ploughs along, Michael and John's story, but it seemed to come out of the second act. There was a whole first act missing. Who were these people? Where did he come from? We didn't meet the Raupraha character till the end of the film. And I thought, just structurally it felt wrong to me. So, cut a long story short, I was, Robin kept on to me as she did when I made Once Were Warriors. I didn't want to make that either. It's true, isn't it, Robin? She kept hounding me. I said, this is a terrible idea for a film. It's just about suicide, drugs, alcohol and death and just who's going to want to see that? So anyway, long story short, Robin's dragged me kicking and screaming into every one of these films. And I eventually thank her for it. So anyway, they let me restructure a treatment for a film I would make if I was going to make this film. But remember, I still wasn't going to make this film. And then the more I got into it, the more I got drawn into it, the more I started to like it. So I said I'd do it, and the end is 14 to 24 drafts later. COVID actually was our friend because we actually managed to get Guy Pearce. Couldn't get any actors during COVID. We were ready to go during COVID, but no one would let their actors come down through isolation or whatever it was called, managed isolation. and it allowed us to refine the screenplay down to what it is now. And it's an interesting process. I've got a writing credit on this film with Shane Danielson, who is the lead writer on it. I didn't actually want a credit. I've always worked on the screenplays that I've worked on, but I don't ever want to take a possessory credit because I think it's the director's job to work with the writer and get what they want out of them. If I'd actually written the entire screenplay, then I'd take the credit for it. But I think it works well for me. It always has since I worked with Riwia Brown on Once Were Warriors, because Riwia didn't know how to make a film, nor did I. And so both of us were just flying blind and making stuff up as we went along. I said, what about this and that? And so now I've learned a lot more about, having worked in the American environment, about how to create a screenplay or make the screenplay into the film that you want to make it into. It's quite a process, but now I'm used to it. So I was asked to take a writing credit on this. And I sort of said, okay, I'll take a co-writing credit. So if you see my name up there, it's the first and only time, not the only time because I haven't finished yet, but it's the first time I've taken a possessory writing credit, and I still feel a little odd about it, but I'm sure you'll all forgive me.
Lee, there's a huge amount of te reo Māori in the script as well, and obviously not just Māori characters speaking it, but also your two Australian leads are speaking te reo. So how did you incorporate that into the writing process or the filming?
Well, it was a strange process. I was determined that everyone in this period, all Māori should be in te reo, except for the Tioreore character who spoke English, because he had been to, he's a combination of Hongi Hika and Tioreore. And he's a fierce warrior chieftain. But he had been to London, been to see King George, and like Hongi Hika, had come back and had learned a lot about Pākehā and European life and brought a lot of guns with him, etc., etc. So we had him speak English in a halting manner. And the character of Rangimai, the lead female character, who's a young Māori woman of maybe 22, 21 years old, she speaks te reo throughout, but she learns English through the film, bit by bit, piece by piece. And then we've got, what I needed when I was constructing the screenplay is that in order to explain to the audience what's going on, I had to have an interpreter, a lot of interpreting going on. But I quite enjoyed the idea of there's te reo bouncing around the room, and two people are able to, no, only really one is able to translate properly, and that's played by an Australian actress who could speak no te reo, but ended up in the film speaking it perfectly because we trained her and coached her phonetically. And then she was playing with a Scottish accent. She's an Australian actress playing with a Scottish accent, speaking te reo perfectly. And it's to the credit of her as an actress that she was able to do that under fire, under extreme pressure, because it's not an easy task.
But it's Jacqueline McKenzie, by the way. I'm sorry that escaped my mind for a moment.
Jacqueline McKenzie, she was fantastic. Because it was a co-production, there's not a lot of Australians in it, but the film was prepped and shot in Auckland and shot in North Auckland and around here. But then all the post was done in Australia. But then I had an Australian composer and two Australian leads, and so the balance was, Robin will be able to tell you about the balance, but we struck the right balance, I think, there. It was interesting getting the Australians to speak te reo. And such good actors. Guy Pearce is such a brilliant actor. He doesn't speak much te reo, but he has a burst of it at the end. But when we had the wrap party and we'd finished, we were all drinking down in the long room, he came in on a live video link and talked to us for 5 minutes in te reo. And we were just all floored. He just couldn't believe it. He went away and learned it all. Got himself a couple of tattoos. It really profoundly affected him, the making of this film, because he was surrounded by a culture he didn't know, but he could see and feel it, because it was, you'll know when you see it. Everything we had to get in this film, we had to get it right. It had to be authentic. So you couldn't have anything that felt false or was unreal. But you haven't seen it, so I can't go on about it too much. But,
But you said before, Lee, that it'd be controversial.
Well, it's controversial because the subject is controversial. The treaty is surrounded by controversy this way and that way. People either believe in it or not. It's not law. It's an understanding, like the American Constitution is not law either. It's a set of behaviours that we agreed to follow. And we avoided the treaty in the making of this film. That's why I said it earlier, first in 1824, but had to push it up to 1830 because of a mistake we made in the regency of the British Crown. It was supposed to be, there was a line in the film which was about King George.
Being replaced by William. Yeah.
Replaced by King William, so he had to bump the date up. But
the British royal family intruding on the movie.
But I wanted to avoid the treaty because it's just too freighted with controversy, so we pulled it back. But as a token gesture to the Declaration of Independence and the treaty, I've got a sequence that I just wrote myself at the end of the film. It's a coda to the end of the film, which has a British military presence, which is not there in the film at all, except at the very last coda of the film. The British have arrived with their flags and Union Jacks and soldiers in red tunics, and they're starting to set up a taxation authority. And that's just, and I've got the iwi component that are turned up to sign this document, replacing the Union Jack with their own Māori flag, just as a sign of authority, for those who know about. That's about as far as but when I say that it's controversial, we had to deal with the eating of human flesh in this film, and I decided to take it all out in the end because, there's a controversy over that. Māori were cannibals. No, they weren't. They ate human flesh. There's a difference. There was a reason they ate human flesh I won't go into for another day to tell those stories. You can read some history books and salmon and tell you all about it. But had we introduced the eating of human flesh, I think the audience would have started to tip over towards, it's a savage pagan society where they eat human flesh and therefore they're cannibals and therefore we can't take them seriously, etc., etc., etc. I know a lot of people don't feel like that, but a general audience might. It's why I stripped out all the European characters out of Once Were Warriors. There's only Māori in Once Were Warriors for a good reason. But when you watch it, you relate to those on the screen in front of you. If there were European or Pākehā characters in Once Were Warriors, a Pākehā audience would gravitate towards those people and not the Māori characters. So you have to be very careful when you're constructing these stories as to where you're going to take an audience and where you're going to lead them to. And that's a long-winded answer. But
it's an interesting one. But one of the, I think, possibly controversial things you've done relates to the imagination of the artist in all this, which is to say, this figure is not Te Rauparaha, it's not Hongi Hika.
Yeah.
This other character is not Te Wherewhero, but I've drawn on them, but I'm fictionalising it. And I could see that possibly being an issue with someone who thinks that any recounting of Māori history, even if it's an imagined one, should be grounded in a particular place and a particular iwi.
Yeah, there's the fiction sets you free, actually, from history. History is great, but I don't want to, it's best to avoid historical accuracy. I got in trouble with Te Tukawaru. I was trying to do a film about Te Tukawaru. I still would not want to do a film about Te Tukawaru. He's a real character, though, and that's freighted with controversy because he killed and maimed and captured along the way. And I won't go on too much about Tioreore, but fiction sets you free. People can't come after me and say that's Rauparaha or Rangi Hayata or Te Whero or anything, but you can see that we've drawn on history. There are elements in this film which happened in history, and we've just changed the names and changed the configuration. But those who know the history of this period will see the parallels. I like fiction. I want to do a story one day on Te Kooti, but I don't want to do the Te Kooti story. I want to fictionalise it so that I can escape from all these controversial burdens, because nobody really knows what happened with Te Kooti. And I mean, I worked on Utu, and that was Jeff Murphy's version of the Te Kooti story, and it was it's a good way to go, that to fictionalise it, but the audience, a New Zealand audience knows what's going on, but an international audience doesn't.
That's always the risk, isn't it, with Maori stories? I remember when Wairarapa came out and seeing the New York Times reviewer on television and probably on the NBC Today show, framing it entirely as a girl power narrative.
Yeah.
Because that was the only prism by which he could see it, where I thought it actually was much more complex for a New Zealand audience.
And as I've travelled this path of filmmaking and storytelling, I'm drawn to Māori stories, but there's a large segment of the Māori diaspora that wants to claim their stories as their own. And I've always resisted that. I think these stories are for all of us. The stories that happen within the oral history and the whakapapa of iwi or a hapu is fine. You can own that, but you don't own, to my mind, you don't own history. You can't own history. But in the telling of a history or in the telling of a story, you can shape it in a certain way. But even that, what I'm saying now, is kind of controversial, because there's some people will say, no, we own it, like we own the air and the rock and the water, but it's not about ownership to me. Anyway, I won't go much further because it'll get too controversial.
Now, you've worked with, either directly or indirectly, two of the big names in Maori literature, Alan Duff and Witi Ihamaira, two very different writers, but obviously you adapted two novels by them. Did you have a lot to do with each of them when you were working on that?
Well, unfortunately, with Alan, it's a kind of well-known story that we had to part company with Alan, and I brought in Riwi Brown to write Once Were Warriors, because I felt that Alan was too close to his own material, and he was a male, and it's his story, but the book Once Were Warriors is written from Jake Hickey's point of view, and he drives through it like a train, and it's unstoppable, and it's all from his point of view. And I knew an audience would not sit still for that, really. And so I wanted to swing it to a female perspective, from a woman's perspective, the mother and the daughter. And I wanted a woman to write those characters. And I got Rivi to come in. I'd only met her briefly, and we talked about it, and Robin agreed that she should be the one to pull in. And I said, look, Rivi, you haven't written a movie, and I've never directed one, so we sail into this unknown territory on our own. I said, but what I do know is I will work on the descriptive action in the screenplay. This will happen here, that will happen here. He walks over here and he does this, and the camera moves over here and does this, and blah, blah, blah. I said, do you just write the characters, both male and female, especially the male characters, which she did. Because men tend to write themselves in a good light. Men talking in pubs talk a load of crap, actually, all the time. I used to do that, and I'm very familiar with it. But I would not be able to write. I would always try and big myself up if I was writing a male character. So Riri was ruthless, and she'd spend a lot of time in pubs listening to men prattle on about bullshit. And so she just wrote those characters so well, and especially the women, the mother and the daughter. to me, it was always a mother and daughter movie. It wasn't about Jay Keke. Because I always maintained, correctly as it was worked out, that his presence was so strong as a character. He was always going to drive like a truck right through it. So it had to be their story. So.
Well, it's the same in a way with your adaptation that became Mahana, where the Tioreore Morrison character is like the train, but you're more interested in other characters.
We originally called it the Patriach, and I wish we had stayed with that title, but I won't go into the reasons why we changed it. But it was, it was less violence, but it was a lot of contained violence in Mahana. But it's essentially a love story that is only resolved in the last frames of the film. Working with Whitty is magnificent. He's just so generous. He's unbelievable, really. He just says, I said, Whitty, can I change this? He goes, oh, yeah, change whatever you like. He says, I don't care. He says, in fact, he says, I love these changes you're making. He says, I might go back and rewrite the book. No, he's doing that. I don't know if he's embarked on it, but he said he's taken the matriarch and he's revisited it and he's re-edited it. He said, I always wished I'd put this thing in the matriarch, or I wish I'd done that. And he's watched how film was made and edited and re-edited and how different films are made out of whatever. And he's quite enamoured of the re-editing of his own work. His publishers think he's lost his mind, but... so he says he puts two versions of the matriarch set up in the bookstore. There's the original version, which he wrote as a young man, and then there's the new version.
Well, playwrights can do that. Envy playwrights. They can make changes between performances.
Yeah, I thought it was quite admirable, actually, because we re-edit films.
Why did you choose that novel of all of Whitty's novels? What drew you to that one? Did Robin make you do this?
Robin made me do it, yeah. But at least I didn't resist that one. I thought I'd do that one. No, I wanted to do it because it was set on the East Coast where my father's from, and it's really a kind of postcard to my parents, in a way. There's little aspects of Mahana that, there's scenes in Mahana that come out of my childhood. So I've inserted them into there's scenes. You always put a piece of yourself in each film, and like there's pieces of myself in Once Were Warriors. There's pieces of my parents' life in Mahana, and there's aspects of my parents in The Convert as well too. So I wanted to do Mahana because it was from the East Coast. And it's Ngāti Porou, and it's my iwi, and
it's a Maori
Western. I said to Robin, we've got to go to the East Coast and shoot this. She said, yes, that's a great idea. And then as we started budgeting, I said, well, we can only afford 2 weeks on the East Coast. I said, that's okay, I can do it all in 2 weeks. Then as we got further into the budget, I said, we can afford a second unit in the East Coast. I said, yeah, okay. And in the end, we didn't even go to the East Coast at all. I had to fake it all in Auckland. And so much for...
I thought you were going to tell me that Robin had made you film in Taiwan, because I wouldn't be surprised.
No, but we laugh about it, but, I sort of knew it was coming down the wire. So you'll like this story. On The Convert, I said, you're not going to have this, do this again, Robin. You're not going to... This time I'm going to look all over New Zealand for a location to shoot The Convert. And if it happens to be in Tasman Bay National Park, then we go there. If it happens to be in Lake Tioreore, then we'll go there. And she said, yeah, fine. So I went off on a giant recce on my own, all around, flying around and driving around and helicopters. And I came back and all piles of photographs of Aotearoa that was unblemished by grass or cows or sheep. He said, oh, yeah, well, that's okay, but we can only afford to shoot around Auckland. Jesus Christ. How can I do the story of Aotearoa, the coming of the Europeans around Auckland? But then we went out to Whatepu, and no film crew's ever been allowed to shoot at Whatepu. And I took one look at it and I said, this is where we got to shoot. And I came back and told Robin in the production unit, and they said, okay, we'll you know, it's a scientific reserve, and it's dock, land, and Auckland City Council, and we've got to go jump through all sorts of hoops. And I said, well, just see what you can do. I'd like to shoot it. 18 months later, we got permissions to, it's like pulling teeth. But it was worth it because, as you'll see, it's like extraordinary. Much like when Jane did piano, when we first saw Katikati in the West Coast. It's so striking. It's such a beautiful landscape. And we shot in up at Matapuri too, up in North Auckland. Because I wanted in New Zealand, it's just, all my travels around this country, and I love this country dearly, especially its landscapes, all of its landscapes. I lived on Stewart Island for a year. And Stewart Island is 640 square miles of untouched New Zealand. Literally, there's a tiny settlement there called Half Moon Bay, and that's all there is. Everything else is a giant bird reserve, the way this country used to be. And then if you move around that country in a boat, all the vegetation comes down to the sea and literally comes right down to the water's edge. And I thought that's what New Zealand must have been like, Aotearoa, back then. So the film looks like that. Everywhere you look, there's just the vegetation and timber and trees and birds trying to take over.
Why did you spend a year on Stewart Island?
I went there for a week and stayed for a year because it is primal New Zealand the way it always has been. They chopped out the big remus back in the logging era, but there's still a lot of big remus in there. It's full of kiwis. You can go out at night and not the big brown kiwis, but the brown kiwis, the more regular one. There's hundreds of them all over the place. But feral cats are killing them. And it's just, you can walk all over the island, and I have done, and I've been all around it by boat and everything, and it's just, it's a microcosm of what Aotearoa used to be once, so you can still see it. And the only other place is in Fiordland. Fiordland, deep Fiordland, Dusky Sound, Doubtful, and the others is a original, authentic New Zealand.
For someone who has such a deep love of original, authentic New Zealand, and certainly in The Convert, which will remind you we have seen but you have not, you absolutely feel this different New Zealand that no longer exists. But you're someone who had to spend quite a few years of your life in Los Angeles. How did you survive in such an alien place?
Well, to me, it's not alien. I grew up watching and loving American film because that was all that was available, British film and American film. But the best of American films, your Godfathers, the Deliverances, and whatever you want to name, back when they made dramatic films, they don't do them anymore. I was always amazed at the sheer power of them, the brilliance of the American film directors, most of whom are emigres from Europe anyway. But especially John Ford. I mean, this film is a homage to John Ford, The Convert. I love John Ford movies because his broad landscapes and his the dance sequence in the movie is pure John Ford. I said, we've got to have a dance sequence in this film because John Ford always has a dance sequence in his film. And so I grew up on American film, and when I got a chance to make American film after Once Were Warriors, I just jumped at it. So, but the thing that when you go into the studio environment, which is an entirely different world, it can really swallow you up unless you know what they're on about. And luckily, I'd made before Once Were Warriors, I'd made a lot of television commercials. And wandering into the studio environment is it's the same environment as a commercial environment. When you're directing television commercials, the client and the agency are worried about whether you're going to pull it off or whether you're going to spend their money wisely or not. And that's all an American studio is. American studio is a bank that's going to loan you money to make a picture, and they want to make sure that you're not going to waste it. So I knew how to navigate that landscape. And I actually really quite enjoyed it, hanging out, doing the dialogue with studio executives. No, because once you get the measure, studio executives are worried about their jobs, effectively. They want to run the studio, and if they fuck up, they're going to not run the studio. So there's an intense paranoia that runs around all but the most experienced of studio executives, because it's a game of moving deck chairs. And they want to bring home the big one. They want to do the great film. They want to be part of it. They don't want you to fuck it up, because it fucks up their career as well.
These are all technical terms, by the way.
Yeah. This is for the podcast, to be bleeped out. But so I had some sympathy for their position, and I knew when I was making TV commercials, it was my job to mollify or pacify the client, or reassure the client that he or she was in good hands. And that's what I did in the studio environment. I would work with the executives and my producers, and we'd make sure that they felt, and that I wasn't going to run over budget or like make Heaven's Gate or something like that.
Speaking of dance sequences.
Yeah, which has a dance sequence and on roller skates.
Yeah, it's fantastic. What was your experience working with screenwriters when you moved from working on What's for Warriors to the States?
Oh, it was fantastic. The American screenwriting family is just phenomenal. They're just such good writers. And there's so many of them. There's thousands of them. There's hundreds of great, good ones, and there's dozens of great ones. And but it's such a bizarre environment, because the first film I made was a film called Mulholland Falls. And I had I got the original screenwriter. It had been through, Michael Mann was going to make it, everyone was going to make this film. And they all, when you inherit an American film script, you inherit all the history of it. This thing had been around for 15 to 20 years, gone through all these different directors who had pulled out for some reason or another, different writers. And I said, well, the script needs a bit of work, but it's in good shape. Who do I get to do the work? And they said, well, we'll get you this writer, I forget his name, X or something. He comes in. We had a great time. And we every day we would have, I'd say, and why do we do this and no do this? And he'd write up some stuff and it was brilliant. Then one day he turned in a page of absolute rubbish. And I think he knew it and I knew it. And the producers went, oh, it's rubbish. And they fired him. And I said, what the hell why did you fire the writer? We were getting on fine. He just turned in a bad day's work. No, he's no good. That's terrible. We'll get you another writer. So I walked into the revolving door of American studio. The writer is just dispensable. And they're just, contract hires, daily hires. So they hired the guy that had written the original screenplay back some 15 years ago. And he came back, and by this time he has moved on. He was writing novels, and I said, we sat in the room with him, and I said, this is bizarre, this revolving door of writers. And he says, yeah, that's the way it goes on over here. And I said, so what do you feel about coming back and doing this? And he says, look, they gave me $100,000 and a set of golf clubs. I said I'd do it for, to come back and fix it. And he did. He came back and fixed it. But I still think the writer I started with would have been better, but it's just, But then each and every film I've made in the States or worked on, whether it's a James Bond film or not, I love getting down with the writers and sticking with the original writers. After that experience, I wouldn't let anyone fire a writer anymore, because I really have a great relationship with writers, every writer I've worked with, because I don't take credit for what they do, but B, I have to shape up the film the way I want it to be. And no one teaches you this in film school, how to shape up a picture. When I first went to America, because remember, Rio and I wrote a screenplay, and we'd never made a film before. When you go into the American environment, you're into an environment where it's really professional, and you're supposed to know what you're doing. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I had this instinct to how to shape up a screenplay into the sort of picture I wanted. Take that scene out, take this out, this doesn't work for me, etc., etc. Now I'm sort of used to it, and I'm very comfortable with it. And I can work with any writer in this room and have a good time with them, and because we can say very honestly that this is crap, and this is I expect my writers to tell me that my suggestions are crap, or not, maybe not because of this reasons. And one of the other things that happened on The Convert was we ran out of Shane Danielson. He was the Australian writer that I worked with. His contract ran out, but I still needed to fix the film. So we got Greg McGee to come in. Robin got Greg McGee to come in on an ad hoc basis to tune up. So I rewrote the stuff that was missing for the end of the film, and Greg wrote it, shaped it up, because I'm sort of incompetent at being a good writer, but I know what I want. Then I need someone like Greg to kind of tune it up, and we had a great time. I said, yeah, his credit's on the film, but he really should have had co-credit with Shane, but the WGA doesn't allow that. It's not Shane. When I went back through Shane's first draft and second draft, a huge amount of his stuff survived, so it's right and proper that he's the credited writer on the film.
Lee, can we just go back briefly to something you said? You said you put a piece of yourself into Once a Warriors. Are you willing to say what that was?
I grew up in a pub drinking culture. That was what you did in the 60s and 70s, late 60s, 70s. I enjoyed the culture, but it was, full of cigarette smoke and drinking beer, lots of beer. So I knew the environment that Jake Hickey was in, because I'd been in it. And and I'd been drinking up the East Coast pubs. The East Coast pubs from Tioreore down to Gisborne, there was about 7 or 8 huge wooden hotels. And you go into any one of them and it was like a scene from Once a Warriors, but without the violence. And I remember seeing that, unlike us in Wellington, where we'd have jugs and fights would break out, and the fighting in Once a Warriors was based on what I had seen and the pub culture growing up. Fights would break out, jugs would get used and smashed over people's heads, and that's why plastic jugs are now in use, etc., etc., etc. But once I was on up to Tioreore at the pub, and everyone was drinking out of crates of beer with big bottles. This is not in the novel. So putting those sort of things are things I'm putting in my drinking culture and my marijuana culture and my 70s, growing up in the 70s, is all permeating through there in one shape or another. But not the family destructive. My family is not destructive.
We're going to open up for questions in the second row here.
Hi, Lee. When you talk about tuning up a script,
Yeah.
Having just finished the Masters of Creative Writing with Paula, I'm quite interested in how do you tune up a script,
You have to, you're drawn to the script for a reason. You're either doing it for the money and you do whatever script is in front of you and you just go and direct it, or you inherit a script and you see the faults in it. It's not the faults of the writer. It's the faults that, and The Convert is a classic example. They're not faults. I'm using the wrong language. The original Convert script that I got is not the script I wanted to make. So I was asked what would I do to make it into a screenplay that you would want to direct? So I'd say I would do this, this, and this, and change this character to this and this, and do this and do that. And if that's acceptable, then that's something I'd do. So you've got to be able to see what you want from your story cinematically, and it's different. I'm just one director who has a certain vision of the way he wants a film to be. He or she or other directors in this room will have a different view of a quiet, elegiac story about their grandfather somewhere out in the countryside. I am drawn to stories with high drama high emotions and certain amount of action. I like action in films because it keeps the film alive. I don't mean action films per se like James Bond and Triple X. I know how to do those. They're just endless action. But if I get a screenplay that I want to shape up into the film I want to make, then it means that I have to tell the producers or the writer what's wrong with it, but what I would do to make it my film, the film I want to make. And it's that, when I say it's not taught in film schools, it's just nobody teaches you how to I don't know how to really explain it, how to turn your ideas into the screenplay you want. It means that you have to work with the writer. Nobody teaches you that you have to, here's a writer and you're the director. Well, a classic example of what I'm talking about is Brian De Palma. If you all know who Brian De Palma is, he's someone from yesteryear, but he's a fabulous director, but he didn't give a fuck about screenplays. He'd read the script and he'd just look for the 3 big set pieces in it. And then he'd get the writer, whichever writer he wanted to reshape the screenplay that was in front of him for these 3 big set pieces. He'd throw this out and throw that out. He'd say, this is boring, this is dull. And then something like The Untouchables, he'd say, oh yeah, they say this and they say that. Well, I don't care about those bits. I just want to get to the big shootout at the end on the steps of the station. And so I'm not saying that I'm like Brian De Palma, but it's an example of Brian De Palma is a visual storyteller. And his big thing is big set pieces that audiences go, wow. I mean, it's a very cinematic approach. It's not a lot of dialogue and it's not a lot of descriptive action and stuff like that. But when I say I'm shaping up a script, every screenplay I've worked on, I've had to make it into, I'd have to say to the writer, I'd say, I think we're missing the end is in trouble. And we both agree that it's in trouble, but we wouldn't know how to fix it. We'd throw ideas around and I say, look, I think this happens and this happens. And here's a classic example. And I was working for Paramount making A Long Paper Spider. And we went into making this thriller with no ending. The ending was crap. And I told the studio before we started, I said, this ending won't work, you know. They said, we know it won't work, but you'll fix it on the run. I said, yeah, you've got to be kidding me. I said, so we shot it, and we shot the ending as it was scripted, and it didn't work. We put it in front of a test audience, and I said, I told you it wouldn't work, it was rubbish. They said, well, we'll do to fix it. We've got to write a new ending. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll write you 3 endings. I'll write them for you, and you can pick whichever one you want. But it was a trick, because what I wrote was an expensive ending, a cheap ending, and a middle range, modest budget ending. Of course, they went for the modest budget one. They didn't want to look cheap, and they didn't want to spend a lot of money. So I just shaped up the screenplay for that particular ending that I wanted, and it's in the film.
Thank you. That was a brilliant answer.
Do we have any other questions?
Kia ora. I'm curious about the renaming of the character in the film and why you chose the name Munro.
I called him Munro because originally he was I wanted him to be a Scot. And I wanted him to be a Scot because of the Highland clearances, and he was either going to be Irish or a Scot, because there's a history of Irish and Scots coming out here in the imperial armies of Britain and having an empathy with the Māori, especially the Irish. And I wanted the Irish had been kicked off their land, and the Highland clearances loomed large, and yet they are still pressed into the British army. And I wanted Guy Pearce to be a Scot, so I called him Munro. And but then Guy didn't want to play a Scottish accent, so we just kept him in. I said, well, maybe he's a Scot that's spent a lot of time in London and he's got sounds more English. So. But anyway, we stayed with the name Munro rather than the name that was in the original screenplay.
So Guy Pearce's fault. We have a
It's Guy
question
Pearce's
over
fault.
here.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. You spoke about editing work in hindsight and re-editing work.
Yeah.
And you also spoke about Once Were Warriors not knowing how to make a film at that point. And I wondered if you ever look back and think about anything that you would do differently.
Hey, strangely enough, I wouldn't do anything differently. Well, the history of Once Were Warriors is I thought it was going to be a complete dud. And I thought I was going to get a film off my chest because I've been bleating so much about the lack of urban storytelling in New Zealand. We were telling rural stories back in the 80s and into the early 90s. And I made it because I was a very successful commercials director, that was my living. And I wanted to get a film off my chest. Robin came to me with that, and I said, as I said, to make a terrible film. But in the end, I said, in making it, I decided to go for broke and do everything, just go push the envelope as far as you could on everything. If you're going to beat up his wife, then beat up his wife. Don't not beat up the wife. Beat her up brutally as it would be, etc., etc., etc. You all know what went on there. But it was that very thing that I thought that was never going to work. The whole thing is not going to be a disaster, but nobody would be wanting to go and see it. And it might die a natural death in a little film festival in Spain or something. I honestly believe that nobody would want to come and see it. So it sort of frees you up. It's a dangerous proposition, I'm saying. I've mentioned this many times. If you think that no one's going to see it, you may as well go for broke in every aspect of it. And then, something may come out of it. And I think it's that strange enough, that attitude that, you're still professional and you do a good job and you do everything, but it meant that everything, we just went for broke on everything. I said to Mike Caine, who was the production designer, everything in this film has to be red, black, or brown, or white. Black, white, red, or brown, because those are Māori colours. If you look at that film, it's saturated with those four colours. But people won't really notice it. I say every costume has to be made from scratch. I don't want to, because it was the time of the basketball shorts and Tommy Hilfiger and all that stuff, and I didn't want branded stuff in the film. It's interesting to look back on it now. I've watched it recently, last year or something. The thing doesn't date at all, apart from the cars. The costumes still look fresh. The hip hop is still fresh. Everything about it still looks original. It holds up 30 years later. Because we made these, I said that this pub has to be a giant barn, but we couldn't afford a giant barn, so Mike Caine got a warehouse and painted it black, and then just put a whole lot of beer pub tables around. It cost about $1,500 to build a bar. We just went for broke on everything. We just pushed everything to the limit. But certainly with the actors, there were very few Māori actors, and they were all in that film back in 1993, 92, made it. And it was just terrifying, all the stuff that we'd written in the film that was in there. These interactions between him and his wife was just I was reduced to tears myself one day. I just couldn't take it anymore. It was like, but at the same time, you had to go. No, we've got to go there, and you got to smash your face into the mirror, and you've got to do it properly. It was done as a stunt. But the actors did all their own stunts, It was like, and I'd sometimes wake up and I'd go, what the fuck am I doing here in this film? Because it's, And, you know, the Uncle Bully raping Grace, that's one shot, only once. And it sort of, still to this day affects me, you know.
Well, that film affects a lot of people, I think, Lee.
Thank you. I actually had one question, but I wanted to follow on from that. I mean, how did that leave you, you know, at the end, when you finished making the film? How did everybody feel?
Once Were Warriors.
Once Were Warriors, yeah.
Well, all of us, Stu Driver, the DP, all of us on the front line of that were wrung out like a dish rag. But we all believed in it. And none of us knew what we had on our hands, least of all me. I knew what I had because for once I had to get into the editing room to find out what we really had on our hands. Because there was, but we were all, I won't say we were thankful it was over, but we just couldn't go on doing that stuff day after day. It really wears you out. It does get to you. A lot of people were highly emotional about it, but if you're going to be authentic and you're going to be accurate, see, I took my cue from the British social realists of the 60s, hard-edged, raw, you know, social realism filmmaking. But I also knew that Once Were Warriors was so brutal a story, more brutal than the social realist films of the British, that I had to dress it up as cinema. And so the lighting and the look of the film, the other aspect was that everybody, the family had to look good. They had to be a good-looking family. There couldn't be any unattractive people, and Bess had to look the way she did. Tioreore was handsome. They had to be in love, and they had to. I didn't want people to go. The gang members they don't look like gang members. Gang members don't look like that. We had to create a sort of an environment where you could understand why these two were in love with each other, but when they tore each other apart. But I didn't want there to be. I wanted the family to look attractive and good looking, because they were destructive. There was destruction all around them. So it was a way of, had I had real gang members in there, and at one stage we talked to Black Power about being in the film. Luckily they pulled out and said no, they didn't want to. It allowed me free rein to create my own gang structure. But had they been in it, it would have been too realistic. And I didn't want that. So what I'm talking about is moving from dressing up social realism, really, with lighting from Sergio Leone type of. Actually, look, Once Warriors is a Ken Loach film that looks like a Sergio Leone film. It's cut like a Don Siegel film, like Dirty Harry. That's what it is. It's cut like an American action film. Because I knew that, I told my editor, I said, if we don't get the first 15 minutes right, people will leave the theatre in droves. So the whole opening 10 minutes to 15 minutes of Once Were Warriors is designed editorially to keep people in the theatre, to hook you in and keep you there so you can't leave. And once you can't leave, you're stuck there. But it was all experimental. We had no idea, you know. I didn't know you could take social realism and dress it up as in a cinematic fashion and then cut it like an American action film. But you can do anything with film.
That was amazing, Paula Morris and Lee Tamahori. Thank you so much for that. What a wonderful conversation.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah. And it feels only right to acknowledge Robin Scholes, who clearly needs acknowledging. Robin's retired, and we're going to miss you dreadfully, but you've made some amazing films, not just with Lee, but just acknowledging all your work. Thank you so much.
This podcast is brought to you thanks to generous support from the New Zealand Film Commission, Foundation North, White Studios, the Capitol Cinema, and Images and Sound. The voiceover was recorded by Jamie Irvine and music is by Poddington Bear. You can read more about these speakers at our website, www.scriptoscreen.co.nz.